Thank you very much, Zoom lady. Okay, everybody, welcome back to Writing the Occult, the Fae, for our second session. This is the first of our world tours. I couldn't come up with a better name. I'm really sorry, but it kind of does what it says on the tin. For this session, we are going to head to Asia. We're going to hear from Yvette Tan about the Philippines shortly. But first of all, we're going to head to China with Zweiting Sydney. Zweiting was born in Guangzhou during China's reopening to the West and has lived in cities across China, but emigrated with her family to Britain at the age of 11. She has a unique cultural perspective and bridges her Eastern and Western experience. She also works as a writer, editor, and translator. Has an amazing looking collection coming out in September called Sinophagia, a celebration of Chinese horror. So please keep an eye out for that. The cover reveal happened this week. It's very exciting. But for now, I'm going to hand over to you, Zhuting.
Thank you, Lauren. Okay, I'm going to pull up my tape. The yeah. Pull up my. Is it showing? No.
No, it's not. So if you hit share screen and then you want to hit the specific window view that you want to share.
So I've share screen desktop.
Don't share your
Yeah.
desktop. So if you go share
Oh
screen,
no. Okay.
and then it'll bring up a whole stack of different options. So if you share your presentation.
Okay. So
Otherwise, if you want to send it to me by email really quickly, I can share it for you if that's easier.
off files. Basic. It says iPhone. I'll just send it to you. Sorry.
Yeah, if you bear with us, people, we will just grab if you just email it to me, I will quickly download it and share
Yeah.
it for you.
Sorry about this. I should be able to say the first bit without the. It's
Cool. Yeah, if you want to get started when I receive the slides, I'll start bringing them up, and then you'll just need to do the next slide, please thing. It's all good.
I think maybe I don't have it set up.
Yeah, it might be you need to do something with your desktop. But yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if you've sent it over,
Yeah, so I
maybe
just
yeah.
start then.
If you just start, yeah, I will keep an eye out for it
Okay, great.
and yeah,
Thank you.
share as soon as I can.
Now, China has a rich mythological landscape full of dragons, gods, demons, jiangshi, ghosts, and giants. One thing that it doesn't have, though, is fairies. I know that this may come as a surprise to many of you, not the least of whom people who booked me for this talk, but I hope to explain to you why you may think there are, what these actually are, and some of the issues with calling them fairies. There have been trading routes with China ever since the days of Marco Polo. Europe at the time was mainly interested in the pretty silk patterns and the pottery. And when they actually began to consider the native belief systems, it was a rather one-way street of an attempt to civilize the Cathay by sending missionaries to instill Christianity into those heathen hearts. This was perhaps the first mistake because religion and mythology in China are wild and weird. The spiritual landscape is one that is an absolute amalgam of every religion which has crossed its path, from Jainism to Islam to Buddhism, Taoism, shamanism, ancestral worship, and so forth. So Christianity really stood very little chances. In fact, between the Chinese ability to weave in any new beliefs into its colorful tapestry and the simplicity of the Christian tracts, we ended up in 1850 with our own Jesus Christ. The scholar Hong Xiuquan was a man who amassed over 20,000 disciples. He claimed that he was the named successor to Christ, and he was going to lead China out of devil worship, inequity, and the twin evils of foreign occupation and the corrupt imperial court. Didn't end so well for him. He was killed in a massive insurrection, and he was cremated, and then his remains were shot out of a cannon to make sure that they completely dispersed. This uprising led to two major changes. One was a more militant approach from the European powers, which then led to the Opium War, the Boxer Uprising, and the eventual occupation of China by Japan in 1937. And secondly, there was a more considered kind of approach to Chinese beliefs. It was thought that if they couldn't replace these beliefs, they would belittle them. Now, the modern idea of the fairy, i.e. the ones that are buzzing around in your garden on butterfly wings and are wearing these couture petals, you know, the Victorian and Edwardian creation, this actually aligned quite well historically with the increased interest in the Orient. Lauren, have you received the presentation?
No, I haven't received it yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We can also share it with participants after the event if you're okay with doing that, if it doesn't come through in time. Yeah.
Okay.
If it's a big file, it might just take a while to whiz along the internet.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'm just trying to see open system preferences. Okay. Open, I'm accessibility. Is it accessibility camera?
No, if you hit that share screen, when it brings up, when it says desktop, that is what you want to choose, but you want to have your, if you put your, is it a PowerPoint that you've got?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you put it, you want to share the window that has the PowerPoint on it.
Okay. It's taking me to system preferences.
Yeah. So you might just need to let it do that, but then
Privacy file.
yeah, you'll I think you'll need to you would need to restart your computer to do that. So I think let's just keep going.
Okay.
Yvette is also offering for you to send it to her and she can try sharing it. But I think you've sent it to me, so I think it is just making its way to,
Okay,
yeah.
sure. It's such a shame because I'm
Some
actually
beautiful
really
pictures,
happy
I'm
with
sure.
it. Really helped with some aids because I'm trying to explain a different
Yeah.
idea to the
Yeah.
kind of it's expected one of fairies.
Mm.
Okay, hopefully it'll arrive soon.
Yeah.
Did
And
it
we can also, I mean, with if you want to just keep speaking, and then if needed, we can you know, hopefully it'll come in the next sort of little while, and when you're finished speaking I can always show the pictures that you're talking to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I was at the modern idea of fairies. So yeah, the modern idea of fairies aligned with the increased interest in the Orient. And so we had gentlemen explorers and collectors gathering folk tales on their travels to the Far East, and also from the Chinese immigrants that were beginning to make their way around the world in institutions like the British Navy and also in kind of occurrences like the American folklore rush. So these beliefs, these kind of collections were often very heavily interpreted, or they were relayed to people who didn't really have the language skills to get every nuance. And they were not published in the kind of grandiose styles of the Greek and Roman legends, but rather they made their way into children's books with quaint little titles such as The Marvelous Adventures of the Mandarin Fun Home. I'm not even sure what a fun home is. The Chinese fairy and folk tales, fables and parables of China. Many of them were by scholars like the German-American socialist Wolfram Eberhard. Whilst scholars like Eberhard may have had the best of intentions, their various publications were kind of setting the direction for 20th century sinology, and he was one of the main culprits of reducing the myriad of ethereal Chinese beings and creatures into fairies. Now, what has been substituted as fairies is the xian, the Chinese concept that is termed, oh, brilliant, thank you, fantastic.
All right, so do you want me to just flick through these so you can, yeah.
Yes, please. So I had, so that was for the, this kind of infantilized, simplified storytelling of the Chinese mythology and spirits, showing some popular publications. And yeah, if you could just stay on this slide. Yeah, number 3. And we're on number 3, please.
Well, number 3, the Chinese concept of xian. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Chinese concept of xian. So this term, it is the Chinese term for the immortals and enlightened beings, and it's a concept that's existed in Chinese literature since the 3rd century BCE, and it's evolved from ideas of the very spiritual into the more physical. The thinker and philosopher Zhuangzi was one of the first writers to write about these beings, and he thought of them as spirits that lived on magic islands. So here are the many facets of xian. The term most commonly refers to Taoist celestials. These are deities of the pantheon who reside in the skies, and they're assigned various roles to take care of things in the mortal world. The xian are also the spirits of animals, plants, and objects, and these can live in many places. In the mortal world, this term has been used to refer to living beings, so people who strove to attain longevity by physical training, and they gain such powers as combat and superpowers like sorcery and flying. You may often hear them being called cultivators. In folklore, the xian are hermits, wise men that live in the mountains, wise men and women, and people that live in the mountains. In fact, the Chinese character for xian, which I have here on the screen, is literally a character that marks a person that lives in the mountains. Furthermore, the xian are, of course, enlightened sages who transcended their earthly existence. And lastly, they can also sometimes be granted as an honorific to those people who are really, really good at something. So those with extraordinary skills. Could I have the next slide, please? The main groups you'll probably have come across as referred to as fairies are probably the Qi Xianyu, the 7 celestial maidens, who you can see on the right, and on the left, the Ba Xian, the 8 immortals. Now, myths around the 7 celestial maidens is quite interesting as a point of illustration. Sometimes when Westerners run up against the polytheistic nature of China, it can be a bit bewildering, because you not only have the multiple pantheons, but a lot of beings outside of them. They all seem to come from disparate conventions. So there are immortals, deities, goddesses, demigoddesses, but also the Jade Emperor and the Great Mothers. And it's quite common for Chinese deities to have several lives, different guises that weave in and out and through Buddhism, Taoism, and folklore. So about the seven qi xianyu, the seven celestial maidens, they were in the earlier times the offspring of the supreme goddess, Xi Wangmu. Nowadays, they're mostly thought of as the daughters of her and the Jade Emperor. So basically the most powerful couple in Taoist heaven. There are 7 of them, and the fact that they were portrayed as the 7 beings floating about in 7 colored robes in the fantasy epic Journey to the West kind of immortalized their popular image as these 7 colored combo, which may have rendered them even more likely to be fairified. Actually, in fact, their story is more accurate as the story of the seventh celestial maiden. They're in fact I missed a bit in my talk. So what they are in fact they're the deities, Taoists in the Taoist pantheon, and they are put in charge of various aspects of the welfare of mortals. So could I have the next slide, please? So slide 5. So they take care of things like making sure there's good weather, plentiful offspring, that people have successful careers and good fortune, longevity, good health, fruitful relationships. It's the youngest one of these, the 7th I was talking about before, who becomes the famous one. So her story is most likely to have come from the pantheons interacting with folklore via the tale of the 7th sister Zhang. This is a story from a village in Henan in north-central China. And it's a story of a village woman who persevered through the hurdles of her romantic relationships. And it evolved into the youngest of the 7 celestial maidens traveling to the mortal world to have a look and, look at the plants and flowers and look at the world. But she commits this the ultimate taboo of falling for a mortal named Dongyong. So as you can imagine, they're set apart, and but eventually the supreme goddess takes pity on them, and she whips out her hairpin and makes a river between the 2 for them to connect. I'm wondering if this is starting to sound familiar, because of course the more famous version of this story is the star-crossed one, the one with the star-crossed ending. This is the tale of the cowherd and the weaver, the lovers who are divided by the galaxy, but lovely magpies build a bridge across the galaxy for them to meet every year. So another group that you might see on old charms and medallions referred to as the 8 fairies is the Basian, or 8 immortals. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is really a group that was created to popularize Taoism through the deification of once living mortals, a process that's quite common to Chinese belief systems. This one, so some of a few of the 8 can be described fairy-like. So, for example, one of them is Han Xiangzi, the handsome sage Han Xiang, who was a literary genius, who abandoned his said career as a civil servant academic and he is known for his marvelous feats of gardening, kind of growing peonies with multicolored petals and making sprouts grow in an instant from a pot. There's also romantic stories of him involving mermaids and his bamboo flute. Another one that might be mistaken for a fairy is the female of the group, the celestial healer, He Xiangu. You can see her on the left there. Many legends across China claim her as their own. They all say that she comes from that region. Essentially, she's from an ordinary household, like something like the daughter of a tofu seller, who was just very nerdy about plants and minerals. She was either given the fruit of immortality, the Pantao peaches by the supreme goddess, or she met an old man, i.e. a xian that I was talking about before, in the mountains, and he gives her the fruit. There are stories of her flying around gathering herbs. I suppose it could be excused as quite fairy-like. Generally, though, the Basian are quite earthy and fallible deities. So we also have Lu Dongbin, the one with a sword there on his back, who was an exorcist and sword master. He was a scholar that failed at the imperial exams, but he met a wise man who guided him to pass the 10 grueling trials against earthly temptations, and he transcended his mortality. He is probably the neatest and most kind of normative of the 8 immortals, except that he's drunk most of the time. We've also got Lan Caihe, the immortal songster, on the right there. Immortal songster, right. So we had the one with the bamboo flute. Yeah, he's on the rightmost in the picture. And they were, actually, I refer to them as they instead. They were a traveling musician who once lived either as a hermit or as a brutally murdered official. And they were known for their charm and kindness to the poor and their gender fluidity. Usually they're in tattered robes with wearing just one shoe. We also have Cao Guojiu, the Uncle Cao, the celestial statesman. Here's the one in red in the official's hat. His story is essentially one of redemption, path of redemption from a reformed criminal. Then we've got Zhang Guolao, or Old Zhang, the immortal trickster, who may have been a con artist in his mortal life. He's known for his magical escapades, such as bringing the dead back to life. He's changing his appearance on a whim, and a lot of other kind of naughty but impressive things, including sticking 2 fingers up at the rich and powerful. So typically he is presented as a surly elderly man who rides a donkey backwards. Here he is at the front here, not riding a donkey, but so hardly fairy-like. We also got Tie Guai Li, Iron Crutch Li, the legendary healer who looks like a disheveled beggar. Here is a one with a dark, warm complexion there. So he looks like a disheveled beggar who has a walking impediment. He carries a walking stick and usually quite a large gourd. So he's known for his stories of him testing doctors and healing the poor and needy with his herbal poultices, these amazing poultices that he invented himself. The last one here is the Han Zhongli in the middle, with the 2 buns and the fan, 2 hair buns in the fan. He's a mad Taoist who is a protector deity. The stories about him say that he was once a failed a betrayed courtier politician, or either that or a general who lost in battle. Either way, he ran into the mountains and met a beggar monk who then kind of introduced him to the secrets of immortality. He's rather portly, quite hairy, and again, not very focused. So you can see that the 8 immortals are the xian in 2 senses. There are the enlightened ones who transcended immortality, and then transcended mortality, and then many of them are also extraordinarily skilled in what they do. If anything, they're closer to the idea of saints. But however, the pan-Oriental interests of the 20th century Western scholars kind of meant that they alternated between the terms genie and the German word fee, which of course means fairy. In fact, the whole art of English-Chinese translation was very new then, with the heavy reliance on the very practical-minded Wei Zhao's dictionary. When Oriental studies became eventually area studies from the 1950s onwards, it was very much in the light of the Cold War. So therefore, not very kind of helpful towards better understandings or improved terminologies. But now we're in a very different world, yet those inappropriate terms persist in literature like academic books and also in the media. And these Chinese companies bring their productions overseas, of course, they're not aware of this background. They just do a search and they find the most common term and they stick it in their English title. But we can clearly see that in contemporary Chinese storytelling, the xian signify all those things I just discussed. So let me give you a few well-known examples. Next slide, please. That's the last slide. Thank you. So, love between fairy and devil. Recently, the biggest Chinese drama hit on Netflix. The fairy in question is a xian in 2 senses. She's a celestial. She's also an orchid spirit. By the way, the devil is not a devil either, but maybe that's for another talk. Then there's things like the fox fairy, shows like the fox fairy, which should be the fox spirit. The princess is a rabbit fairy, again, should be rabbit spirit. And the last one is one of my ongoing bugbears, Sword and Fairy, the most influential and longest running xianxia series in China and internationally. These fairies are actually people who are very, very good with swords, i.e. badasses at fighting, like sword immortals in Blood of Youth. Though this may not have been the talk you were expecting, I hope you are feeling somewhat enlightened and will from now on look at Chinese spirits in a different light. Thank you. I hope I didn't overrun too much.
It's all good, Zweiting. Thank you so much for that, and absolutely encapsulated what we wanted to do with these sessions. Is I said fairy or fae, what does that mean in your culture? And exactly what you showed us. So really interesting, and especially the sort of the translation fails that you were talking about at the end there as well. It's really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're going to have a Q&A shortly, but before we do that, I'm going to invite Yvette Tan onto the screen, as it were. Yvette is one of the Philippines' most celebrated horror writers. Aside from short fiction collections in English and Tagalog, she's written a feature film that received nationwide release and has also co-written a libretto for a ballet that was performed by the Ballet Philippines on the main stage of the Cultural Center of the Philippines. She is here to tell us about, I think, one of the specific fairy-like creatures in Filipino lore. So, Yvette, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Let's see if I can share my screen. Okay, yay. Except this is the wrong, hold on, this is the wrong window. No, this is the right
That
window.
was a nice look at your email there, Yvette.
I know, right? Hold on.
Not too many unreads. My
anxiety wasn't
going
Let me stop
that.
sharing for a bit. And okay. Here we go.
There we
go. Okay. So hello everyone, I'm Yvette Tan, and it won't show anyway. Okay, so the photos won't show. So anyway, my presentation is called Wear Your Shirt Inside Out, Encountering the Encanto. So Encanto is it's what a kind of fairy creature in Philippine folklore. It's actually very, very, very similar to European fae. Let's see if the other pictures will show. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to.
I was going to say, if you sent me your slides earlier, so let me grab them and see if it'll work better on my screen. Keep trying. This is
Okay.
We've got so many speakers. We're clearly, there's always going to be something that goes like this.
So the photos that didn't show, they all come from a specific television show in the 80s called a.k.a. Fairy Call, which means okay, my fairy. And that it shows the Encanto. There, wear your shirt inside out. Next slide, the second slide, please. There, so the Philippines, just to give you a background about the Philippines, so we're a tropical country, we're based in Southeast Asia. We have one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world, and we also have a rich folklore tradition, which includes fairies or beings that can be compared to, it's very, very close to European fae, as I've mentioned. I'm going to be focusing on one family, which are the Encantos. Next slide, please. So just a bit about me. So I'm a Chinese Filipino writer. I have Chinese descent, but I write a lot about Filipino folklore because it's kind of what I grew up with. When I grew up in the 80s, and it was everywhere. Like you'd hear stories about your neighbor having talked to the duende or the dwarves, that sort of thing. So that's kind of what I do. Next slide, please. Part of the stories I heard growing up involved the Encantos or fairies. So there are different types of fairies or creatures in Philippine folklore, but we'll concentrate on the Encantos, which takes their name from Spanish Encanto. The Philippines was colonized by the Spanish for 400 years. So we're very Catholic. We have a lot of Hispanic influences. And so people believe that people believe that the Encantos, because they have European features, which I'm going to talk about, may have been inspired by the Spanish friars. They're usually very fair, as you can see in the photo. Like it's Filipino people dressed in very fantasy-like clothes, and that's kind of how it was projected in the 80s. They're very fair. They have European features. They have like very straight nose bridges. They like dressing in very medieval clothes. The males are called Encanto and the females are called Encantada. So they're also very, like when I say fair, I don't know if you've met a Filipino person. A lot of us are kind of dark. So Encanto's different that way because they have very European features. There are two schools of thought. One is, as I mentioned, they could have been influenced by the Spaniards or maybe the colonizers. The other is that there's also a tradition in Filipino, like indigenous peoples, where there's such a thing as a binukot or a well-kept maiden, a child who was reared in not total darkness, but who has never stepped out in the sun, thus preserving like she's fairer than most. There's a school of thought that might have also been an influence, but it's not a very popular one. Next, please. Okay, the Encantos have different like overall, like there are different kinds of Encantos, but I'm going to run down the characteristics a lot of them have in common. So they live in their own dimension, whose entrances look like natural formations. So a random tree could be an entrance into Encanto land. There's no actual term for it. A strange looking rock, that could be an entrance as well. However, there is one specific city in the province of Leyte called Biringan that's said to be more technologically advanced than this world. In this tradition, it's a blend of fantasy and sci-fi, because there you have flying cars, you have people in futuristic outfits, you have fairies stealing construction materials from the real world so that they can build things in their own dimension. It's a folk belief, but it also has a lot of trappings of, again, science fiction. Fairies, like European fae, they're whimsical and mischievous, and they like making people lose their way. So a common story is, if you're in the forest, you're in the jungle, and if you usually know your way, but you keep getting lost, you keep going in circles, it means that somebody's playing a trick on you. So what you do is you turn your clothes inside out, turn your shirt inside out. If you have a jacket, turn it inside out. They're going to lose interest because they're going to think you're a different person. They lost the trail of the one they were making fun of, and then you'll find your way back. And this actually happens still. The most recent example was growing up, my friend used to take me home every night in college. And then one day, she and a friend took me home as usual, but they couldn't get out. They kept circling my area for like an hour until finally one of them said, okay, we're turning our jackets inside out. And miraculously, they found their way out. So I don't know if it's psychological, but once in a while, these things still happen, even in the 2000s. So they can fall in love with and court or kidnap human beings. Usually, when somebody falls sick and there's no known scientific cure, they're going to take them to an albulario or an herb doctor. And once in a while, it'll either be they did something wrong to somebody supernatural, being, or they'll a fairy has fallen in love with them and it's making them ill, and the fairy wants to take them with them back to its own dimension. So they can fall they're being courted by the fairies. And they can also leave changelings. You also have a changeling culture, but as mentioned before, like once you have the baby, I don't know what happens next, but they can leave, they can take human babies as well, and they can cause sickness or good luck. As I mentioned, they're capricious. They can, if they like you, they'll give you nice things. They'll cause your lucks to change for the better, but if you cross them, they can make you ill. So you have to go to an herb doctor to seek treatment. And they can be kept away by prayer. So we're a very, very Catholic country. We have, because of the Spanish, and a lot of our folk beliefs and a lot of our folk practices now, like especially when you go to a traditional healer, it's always a mix of, there is no pure practice anymore. A lot of it involves Catholic prayers, a lot of Pig Latin. Catholicism has seeped into our traditions, so much so that even indigenous fairies from indigenous folklore can be kept at bay by prayer. So there are good fairies and there are bad fairies. The good fairies are usually dressed like 80s, they were in gowns, prom dresses from the 80s, and bad fairies, like in this photo, this is the henchman of the bad guy in that TV series, and she has exaggerated makeup. It emphasizes like dark colors, whereas quote unquote good fairies, they usually wear light clothes. It's very dichotomous in that way. Dark equals evil, light versus equals good. Next, please. And that goes with other creatures as well. So we have dark colored dwarves, like black dwarves, meaning like they wear black clothes, not they're dark. And white dwarves, which usually means they wear white clothes, and black dwarves are bad, white dwarves are good, that sort of thing. And red dwarves in the middle, who, are more business-minded than anything. So how to spot an encanto? Number one, look at their nose. It is believed that encantos because they're not quite human, but they're not quite the deity either. They don't have a philtrum, which is the line between your nose and mouth. So if you see somebody and the part here is flat, they're probably an encanto. But as we all know, people come in different shapes and sizes, and not everyone might have a prominent enough philtrum, and that might cause trouble here because people will be like, you're an encanto. Or you can claim that you're half an encanto because you don't have a prominent enough philtrum. And then you also look into their eyes. But you can only do this twice a week because there's a belief that if you want to find out if somebody is an encanto, you look into their eyes at noon on a Tuesday or a Friday. I'm not sure why. But if you look into their eyes and then you see that the image in their eyes is right side up instead of upside down, like a normal human being, and then that means they're an encanto. Encantos are sometimes interchanged with diwata. And if you've come across the term diwata, like if you read Filipino folk tales or stories, the difference is diwatas are usually earth spirits. So they're usually tied to a body of water or a tree. And diwatas were what used to be anitos, which are like ancestral spirits that are worshipped. So that's where they come from. And that's why they're different. But so whenever you tell a Filipino encanto, they'll be like, a diwata is also a fairy. And yes, they do have fairy-like attributes as well, but they're more earth spirits. Next, please. Okay, what to do when you encounter an encanto? So number one is do be respectful. So here, as you can see in the photo, the woman is supposed to be an encantada, a female encanto, and the guy is supposed to be a normal human being. I think this was their wedding, but in Philippine folklore, encantos are portrayed as a bit more elaborately dressed than human beings. Okay, do's and don'ts. Number one, do be respectful because they're very moody, so you always want to stay on their good side. And if they really, really like you, they can bring you luck. Number two, do take care of your natural surroundings because again, they live in nature, and if the more nature is corrupted, the more nature is destroyed, the more they're going to move into the city. So now, even though I live in Manila, it's a city, there are some people who still believe that supernatural beings, not just encantos, have moved into the city. They live in our condos. You can still hear stories about them. And I'll tell you a story about it in the end that I just heard that happened early this year. Don't accept food and gifts from them. So like European fairies, you're not allowed to take anything from them because that'll bind you to them, especially if they bring you to where they live, to their dimension. You're not allowed to eat anything because you won't be able to get back to Earth. The interesting thing about this is when I first heard this story, it was very specific. Don't accept red or black rice from them. And growing up back then, before the health food craze, all we had was white rice. So I thought it was very exotic. I thought it was a fairy thing that, okay, fairies ate red or black rice, and that was a sign that it was enchanted. But now we have heirloom rice. We have red varieties, we have black varieties. I realized that fairy lore also like the reason why rice was red and black in fairy lore is because they were growing natural varieties. They weren't washing the rice to make it white. And it shows the link between agriculture and folklore without even knowing it. And okay, don't fall in love with them. So as everyone knows, the fae can be very charming and they can look really, really hot, and they can be very romantic, but you shouldn't fall in love with them because, as everyone knows, it's the same here in the Philippines. If you go with them to their dimension, you die on Earth. And if you realize that they're intentionally getting you lost, turn your clothes inside out. As I mentioned, yeah, it's so that they lose interest in you and they move on. Another story about that was just recently, I was in a motorcycle taxi going to a well-known area, but my driver kept getting lost. My rider kept getting lost. I thought, oh my goodness, am I being enchanted? I was ready to turn my jacket inside out, but instead of that, um, I just took out my Google Maps and I said, okay, it's a different one from yours. I guess it's and it worked this time. And then after I showed him mine, his started working. So I guess that could be a modern way of turning your jacket inside out. It's bringing out a new GSP thing, and they lose interest in you because you found them out. And then if you think someone has caught an Encanto's fancy, seek help from an herbalist right away. Normally, the first thing people do is take them to a medical doctor. And when they realize that there is nothing wrong with them medically, that's when they start seeking an herbalist. And it's important that they do so right away. Next, please. Okay, while Encantos are mostly shown in a positive light, what we're mostly shown, the Philippines now is moving towards I feel a global response towards beautiful things being equated with good, because now there are stories about beautiful fairies and people realizing that, oh wait, maybe the beauty is just skin deep. In this in this slide, we see
snowball fights pigment below.
we see a photo we see a still from the movie In My Mother's Skin, a Filipino film set in World War II that involves a really beautiful fairy that a child befriends and later realizes that she doesn't mean good for her family. So there are also other stories about encounters with them to this day. As I mentioned, I can tell you one that I heard happened just a few months ago, and it involves eating fairy food. So a friend went to a resort in a sacred mountain called Mount Banawe here in one of the provinces. And he asked the caretaker of his resort if there was anything he had to do. And the caretaker said, okay, you only have to do one thing. You have to pray a certain prayer every night at 7 p.m. If as long as you do that, you're fine. And this guy, he's young. He doesn't care. He doesn't believe in these things. He parties. He does it for a couple of nights. Then he forgets the third night and he starts partying. He forgets it. When he comes back to his room after drinking, he sees this creature like covered in mud. And this creature gives him this man covered in mud. And this man gives him something to eat. And I don't know why this guy didn't run out of his room, but he took it and he ate it. And the next thing he knows is he's in a well-known mall in the Philippines. It's called Mega Mall. It's well known. And he's walking through the mall and he's seeing all these people he knows from life. And then he'll cut to him and that creature, that man, muddy man. And that muddy man is saying, look, this is my mountain. This is my river. And then it'll cut back to him, the human going through the mall again, seeing all these people. Happens a bunch of times. And then he awakens the next day, like the caretaker finds him the next day, still in his clothes, like on the floor, unconscious. And he tells the caretaker what happened. And the caretaker was like, okay, this is why you had to pray the prayer. And this is why you never eat anything somebody random gives you. And the takeaway was, because the human mind couldn't process being in that other dimension, it just kept going back to what this guy knew, which was that specific mall and everybody he'd met his entire life. So the person who told me this knows the person who encountered it, and these are, regular people who work in corporate. So it's a very weird story to make up. Next, please. So that's it. Thank you very much. I hope my talk was enlightening and it showed you a bit about folklore in the Philippines. You can reach me there, social media, and my website. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Yvette. That was enlightening as well, and lots of chat going on as well about the different things that you were saying. I we should be in a break right now, so if you do need to take a break, do go off and do it. But we have had some questions come in that I'll put to Zweiting and Yvette. If you do have a question for them, please raise your digital hand or pop it into the chat. But Stephen is wondering if there's any, to both of you, if there's any particular book that you would recommend on folklore from China or the Philippines that concerns magical beings. Maybe Zweiting, if we come to you. Oh, you need to unmute. Oh, okay.
Okay.
It's
There's
all right.
a
Yvette,
growing.
go for
Okay,
it, Yvette,
okay.
while we get, yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay. So there's a growing interest in folklore in the Philippines. So you can actually find a lot of websites that talk about this. You can go to the Aswang Project, I'll write it down, or philippinespirits.ph. There's a list that you can go through there. Most of the books are print, so they might be hard to get in your part of the world, but I think some of them are print on demand. I can list them down. I can list down the sites on chat.
That would be great. Thanks, Yvette. Swaiting? There we go. You're unmuted now.
Yeah, so I would generally recommend, there didn't used to be a lot of good kind of books that represented kind of Chinese mythology and beings in a kind of an appropriate light, but now there are more. So I would recommend Tao Tao Liu's books. I think she's written at least a couple of them on Chinese mythology. I use them to write my own as well. And then there's a book called Religion in China, which is a very, very complete, comprehensive kind of a look at Chinese religion, including these ethereal creatures, or different kinds in Chinese religion, making all the connections between society, culture, and Chinese beliefs. And then, of course, I would also recommend my own two books. There is as I write nonfiction, there's From Kuan Yin to Chen Mao, which is a deity guide. And then this is more like if you're interested in like the evolution, development of certain deities and their significance in kind of pop culture and the media. And then there's Chinese myths, which is a more general look at kind of Chinese religion and beliefs, sort of more kind of something that you can dip into. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, do check out the works of both Zweiting and Yvette. Amazing, amazing people. Is there any final questions? Otherwise, we will let everybody have a 5-minute break. Oh, Abby is asking what role you think localization plays in these translations. Is it, Abby? Localization?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you both for your chat. And I typed really quickly there. I'm just curious in that, you noted some mistranslations. I'm just wondering how dangerous or how much that kind of affects people's perceptions on some of these both the Encanto and what you were speaking about as well.
Zweiting, maybe since you're the translator, do you want to start with that?
Yeah.
There's a massive kind of a difference. It makes a massive difference. As as I was, all those things I was talking about in my talk, how these there's a kind of myriad of different creatures who are, from kind of animal-based creatures to humanoids to ghosts, spirits, demons, all of these, and spirit kind of gods and deities, patron gods, sages, all of these, if they're just kind of referred to as one thing, that really, really kind of limits the understanding of them, and furthermore, putting them in, a lot of words have a lot of different connotations in each culture. And so that's why in translating and interpreting, translation is a process of interpretation, and it's very important to consider the words properly, especially when you're naming things for the first time. So yeah, I would say, and when it comes to kind of things like diplomacy and history and politics, that's even more kind of important to get the concepts right, so that they're properly localized. And that's one of the things I always try to do in my fictional translations, and as well as my non-fiction work, to try and retain the significance of certain concepts and ideas and phenomenon in its original culture. And of course, I would always try and make it work for the English Anglophone audiences and readers, but try and retain that so that there is a way of my aim is always to promote understanding and kind of clear misperceptions and misunderstandings. So yeah, it's really important.
Well, thanks. Yvette, anything to add in terms of localization for you?
Well, okay, so Encanto is an umbrella term, as I mentioned, and this comes from the Philippines being a country kind of made up of different ethno-linguistic groups, and everyone just finding one name for a bunch of different beings that have the same characteristics. So if there's anybody, like if anybody Filipino sees this, they might come at me and say like, but no, this spirit does this spirit does this. But if you say Encanto, everybody knows, okay, this is what it does. These are its characteristics. I guess it's shorthand for fairy in essence. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
That was lovely. Thank you both.
It's the opposite of localization, actually. It's so that it because we're so hyper local, we need something that everyone understands, and that is our term for it.
Great stuff. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but you can find both Yvette and Zweiting on social media. I'm sure they'd love to have more chats about this stuff with you. And yeah, if you could please unmute and let's give them both a round of applause. Thank you so much. We've got some virtual ones going on as well. We are going to go straight into our next session because the wonderful Gabriella has arrived. I can see her sitting there waiting and ready. So we will have our next break in an hour's time. But as I said at the beginning, this is being recorded. So if you do need to pop out, get some food, do what you need to do, totally fine. You can always catch up. And that's it. But Zweiting and Yvette, thank you so much for joining us and kicking off our world tour. And hopefully you can stick around for some of this. Otherwise, I'll send you the recording as well and you can watch up, because I know, especially for Yvette, it's very late for you. So yeah. Awesome. Thank you both.
Thank you. I do have a paper to hand in tomorrow, but I look forward to seeing the recording, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You're doing, is it a PhD you're doing, Zweiting?
It's in a master's degree.
Yeah, master's. Yeah, so we have an academic deadline that has to take precedence, absolutely. But thank you for being with us anyway.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the convention.
Thank you. Alrighty, Gabriella Houston, hello.
Hello.
I'm just going to spotlight the two of us so that, there we go. Hi. Everybody, we are ready to move on to the next session of this wonderful day, all about the Fae. We are going to be in conversation with Gabriella Houston. Gabriella is a Polish, UK-based artist and author of Slavic folklore-inspired novels, both for children and for adults. The children's books, The Wind Child and the Storm Child, and the adults books, The Second Bell and The Bone Roots, are out there now. for you to grab. Gabriella also hosts a YouTube and Spotify show called the Gabriella Houston Project, storytelling in all its forms, which you can find on all good podcast and YouTube places. And if you want to know more about her, you can sign up for her newsletter at gabriellahouston.com. But for now, hello, Gabriella, and welcome to Fae Day, as I have been affectionately calling it online.
Thank you for inviting me. I mean, I already, I've been in a hurry all day, but I just caught the end of a previous session and the standard is really high. So I hope I meet the expectations.
No, absolutely. And hey, you have the extra less pressure of just being chatting with me. You don't have to worry about technology. Someone said earlier that the gremlins, the fairies of the internet, were getting into the system for us in that last session because none of the presentations wanted to work. But we got there in the end. It's all good. We're here. We're loving it. So thank you. Gabriella, I gave a really quick introduction to you then, obviously, but could you tell us a little bit about yourself? You know, what is it that attracts you and why are you here with us today?
So I'm Polish. I came to the UK at 19 to study English literature. So my love affair with like Slavic mythology is a complicated thing. So in Poland, you know, growing up, like Slavic folklore was something that was only really given to small children. Like you would get some picture books with extremely gory stories of, you know, the drowned spirits of drowned men and all that. And but then as you grow, there was this gap. There's now being kind of filled, but there was definitely this gap. There was some Sapkowski, you know, obviously the Witcher sort of series. But by and large, I kind of moved on, like from a young age, I was always interested in folklore and mythology, but then I was exploring more other mythologies, mostly, you know, European, like, you know, Egyptian, but like Norse and Greek and English. And only as an adult, I came back to Slavic mythology, and I feel like having read about different mythologies, it kind of gave me a very different perception of it, and that difference in value systems and how things were presented was something that really drew me to it.
So can you tell us a little bit more about Slavic folklore? That's a very big question, I know. Some of it is familiar to us, some of it is less familiar to us. Obviously, people who have read your books will have had an idea about it as well. But what sort of unique characteristics do we see in Slavic folklore?
So a quick disclaimer, first of all, like, you know, Slavic people are the largest ethno-linguistic group in Europe. So there's, you know, Slavic people are not just, you know, like there's Russians, there's Poles, Ukrainians, you know, Czechs, but Bulgarians, Croatians, you know, so there's, that's a huge amount of land. And so there will be differences between the different sort of Slavic countries, but they are, and Slavic people traveled a lot as well. So there is, but there are stories that are very similar. The name might be a little bit different, but you will get this virtually the same story in Poland or in Croatia or in Russia. It's quite difficult to sometimes give people a very clear idea of Slavic mythology, because there were many attempts to kind of distill or sometimes unify Slavic folklore, depending on people's political motivations. So sort of late 19th and early 20th century, for example, there were the movements in Poland, Młoda Polska, but there were similar, so Young Poland, but there was like similar movements in, you know, Ukraine, Czech Republic, but try to find like a national sense of identity and national style. So a national artistic style And people of that time in those countries were very interested. So Poland was sort of occupied by foreign forces at the time. So there was this need to kind of, people would go into the countryside and they would gather folk tales. But then on the Russian side, there was the movement of Pan-Slavicism, which had a very political dimension, because obviously from their perspective, it was all about unifying all Slavs under the protective umbrella of Russian culture. So the movement from that side was, oh, we're all completely the same, right? Yeah. So there were those definitely opposing sort of political motivations and forces, and that might have sometimes colored the way those folk tales were recorded. Slavic folk tales also don't have, we don't have Eddas, right? We don't have metamorphoses. We have no written record from, you know, ancient times about Polish, you know, or like other Slavic nations, religions and beliefs. And, you know, part of that is to do with a very turbulent political history of that period, including the way that those lands were Christianized, right? So the way Norse countries were Christianized, it was a more gradual process, right? So you had monks who would, you know, out of interest, write down the stories that were passed down, you know. So that's why we know so much about Norse mythology, for example. Whereas in countries such as Poland, you know, we were between two Christian countries in, like, you know, year 1000, or just before the year 1000. And both those huge imperial powers were very keen to sort of, you know, invade at any moment in order to Christianize the heathens, right? So the Christianization of those Slavic lands was a defensive process. And so it was performed very aggressively. It was, and the preservation of the earlier beliefs was not a priority at all. So right now, what we have of, especially mythology, because there's a difference between folklore, right? Yeah. The everyday stories that people would sort of pass down, and kind of the small creatures, the small spirits of the everyday, and you have the mythology, right? So especially when it comes to the mythology, we have very little sources. So very few sources. So it's basically everything we know is cobbled together from ethnographers, you know, between ethnographers, linguists, and archaeologists, anthropologists, and they all kind of piece it together. So, you know, unfortunately, the result of that is that you will have vastly different interpretations of the pantheon. I had a conversation recently, I interviewed for my program, Dr. Francis Young, who is an English professor who specializes in the history of belief. And he has particular interest in the mythology and the beliefs of the ancient Balts. So that's Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. So those are the like Slavic people, but they have their own ethnic subgroup, the Balts. And he's saying that basically, just when he was describing how they piece together the pantheons and people's belief, it sometimes feels to the outside eye very tenuous. So there is a great deal of difficulty. So like for me, I compare a lot of different stories from different, you know, and I'm looking for the kind of similarity in values. And I'm looking for, and you have to try, and if you really want to go to the kind of ancient Slavs belief, you have to carve away bit by bit the Christian influences, which changed the entire value system of the ancient Slavs. So so that's a very interesting sort of point to me.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting. It's not something it's obvious when you say it, but it's not something I personally necessarily think about when I think about folktales and folklore, is both that political and religious aspect and influence on them. We will talk about, your own works in a sec, but I'm just wondering how you personally navigate those sort of political and religious aspects to sort of decouple them from the actual tale.
So because I am I'm not an academic, I don't approach it as an academic would. I approach it as a kind of cultural magpie. So I'm looking at the interesting things that can inform my writing. But I am very conscious and I'm very interested in preserving the what to me is this like authentic feel of those stories. And that's not just to do with the kind of small everyday actions that people take in their lives, but it's also to do with how they view the world and their own place in it. So sometimes it's easier to separate the, for example, Christian influences on the folk tales, because you will have a very obvious add-on to the end of a story. For example, so Slavic people really seemed to me to put great value on the concepts of mutual respect and on the concept of understanding of the other. So there is one story, for example, which is all about basically the hero befriends this little spirit, and through a kind of a barter system, it helps. So the character helps this little spirit, and then the spirit in turn brings him great wealth. Right? This is not a very complicated story, but the idea is that you kind of learn about what this character is about, what this character needs, and then it's if you show kindness, then this kindness will be returned. And then you have the small Christian add-on is, but after they might have lived in peace and prosperity, but after they died, all the characters went to hell, because you should not have any dealings whatsoever with demons.
Right.
So that is a pretty easy thing to separate it. Sometimes those value systems are really kind of woven into the story, and it's harder to tell. For example, there's like Strzygas, where the are pretty well known through the Witcher series. So they usually were considered just like pretty much straightforward monsters, right? Or kind of like vampiric creature. But Strzygas could either be born, or they could be a result of a curse. Sometimes it could be a kind of post-mortem curse. So, if this cursed person dies, then they come back as a Strzyga. And there's a variety of stories about this particular creature. But the one that I found particularly interesting was about the breaking of a curse. And I think like Sapkowski is really borrowed from this story in particular. But the main character is like his defining characteristic is that he just helps everybody he meets on the road. No matter how despised the person by the people around them, he's just kind to everybody. He's a simple bloke. He just wanders around, and then he wanders to this rich man's castle, and of course he finds out about this Strzyga, who is his daughter. And the way he breaks the curse is he crawls into the Strzyga's tomb, so that the creature cannot hide in a tomb during the day, and so that's when the curse is broken. But in this particular version of the story, it's not the act of taking Shiga's place that literally that breaks the curse. It's the metaphorical taking of its place that breaks the curse. And so this hero, by going into Shiga's tomb, takes on all of Shiga's pain. He feels it's a beautiful description of empathy in action, of basically just taking on the Shiga's pain, understanding the Shiga's loneliness, and just feeling the same emotions that this very confused girl who was cursed felt. And that by taking those emotions on and feeling them himself, that's how he breaks the curse.
Wow.
But that is a lesser known version of the story, but I think it more beautifully describes the values of those communities.
Absolutely. Someone's just asking you if you could repeat the name of that story.
Oh, it was just it was in a book of story tales in Polish, and it was just called Strzyga.
Yeah. So speaking of Strigas, that was the subject of, or the sort of characters in this one, the second Bell, your first book. And you're right, you mentioned the word vampire there, and I'd always thought Strigas and Strigoi were vampires. And so I was really surprised when I was reading this to find out that that's not. And now, hearing that story, I can understand where some of this came from. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about the process of taking inspiration from these creatures of folklore and turning them into your novel?
So I had a pretty different approach in the different books I wrote.
Okay.
So the one you held up, the second Bell, is it was a lot more sort of subverted, the myth, because in most of the stories, Strigas are just cursed. They're just, they're just demons. And so I thought about the perception of the community and how strong that perception is, and how hard it would be to go against that perception. So that's what the whole story is. And in a sense of this original myth, I just told you, the character does what nobody else did.
Yeah.
He goes in and he actually understands this girl, and he understands what she went through. And so with the second Bell, it's it's hard, like a story of mothers and daughters, right? So every now and again, as a child that's considered to be a Strzyga is born into the community, they're considered to be monsters, because they're known to have those strange powers that are seen as being purely evil, purely dangerous. And so such a child can either be abandoned on the edge of the forest, or the mother can choose to leave with the baby, never to return. And so I have thought about how strong and lasting communities, laws, and perceptions are. In terms of that, you can take those mothers who chose to leave with their children. They have formed this small community high up in the mountains. But just because they left the community doesn't mean that they left all the community beliefs behind. So, if you were told your whole life that a child that was born with two hearts is evil, then you wouldn't just think, oh, well, I have one of those, I'm sure it's fine. You would always have in the back of your mind the worry that your child, that you could have been wrong in protecting your child, that maybe, just maybe, you were wrong. And I think that that sort of drive to protect, but also the doubt, is a powerful thing. And I think there's, like, in Slavic folklore in general, I think there's there are some things which are straightforward. Certain creatures are bad, certain creatures are good, but there's a lot of ambiguity too. And I think there is a lot of people knowing that there are creatures that have their own laws that we know nothing about.
Yeah.
And that there is all this, and that sometimes doubt is a good thing. And I think sometimes people who have no doubt, who know they're doing the right thing, the good thing, are the ones who can cause the most damage.
Absolutely. And you know, we see that repeated so many times through books. It's like and even in the folk tales, it's like the moral of the story sort of thing, isn't it? It's they're there for a reason, these tales. And you're mentioning a few times now about the community and the idea of, you know, community laws and things like that. A lot of that does come through in these folk tales as well. And when you're thinking about fiction, that's part of your world building. So I just wonder if you've got any tips for people. We're mostly writers here, probably here because we want to write about fae creatures and folkloric creatures. You know, how do you go about building that world? Because your worlds are so believable and so rich. You really, you really feel like you're in these villages. You really feel like you're part of these communities. So how do you go about your world building?
I think, you know, the main thing for me, and that's something that I always tell people anyway, is that reading very widely is very crucial, because also some things, if you're focusing on just one folklore, one part of the world, so some things will elude you. Like when I said that as a child I read some Slavic folk tales, and then I read, Greek folk tales, I read Norse, the things that were available to me. Obviously, there was not a lot available about, Chinese mythology or Japanese mythology when I was growing up in, post-communist Poland. But I would not have noticed, for example, if I hadn't read Norse mythologies, Norse myths, I would not have noticed the difference in the loss of hospitality, for example. And if you are, and that's sometimes something that I see in people who are not, sometimes maybe not from the culture, and they have not seen, they don't seem to have read widely enough. So they will take like one character, but they apply the same societal rules to the creature that exist in a different culture. And like I notice, for me, that is quite noticeable. So, for example, when I mentioned the hospitality laws in Norse myths, there is a very regular breaking of hospitality sort of relationship and protection. People get invited for dinner and then they get murdered, on second course. You can be traveling with somebody, so you've traveled together, you ate together, and then 4 is going to try and bash your head in. So for example, ancient Slavs, that is absolutely unimaginable, because the law of hospitality was absolute. And we still have some of those traditions today, where when a couple gets married or when someone travels from far away, and it's like a more official sort of setting, people greet you with bread and salt. And because once you break bread, you are under the protection of that household.
Okay. And
for the duration of your stay, it doesn't matter. Yeah, no red wedding. Someone's comment. So someone comment exactly. And we have myths that talk of people who broke those laws. And that is absolutely, we have a myth of King Popil, who, to guarantee the succession of his young sons, he and his wife plotted and, basically invited all of the political rivals, and poisoned them all. And the whole earth rose against them. And mice started in their thousands and then millions started coming in like a wave. And basically, no matter how far they ran, the King Popil, his wife and his sons were eaten alive by mice.
Oh, wow.
That is like, but that is such a like popular myth in Poland, because the rejection of your guest and the kind of the breaking of that trust is yes, it's not forgivable, right?
No.
But you would, so that is the kind of thing that you put something about breaking bread, you know, in a kind of Slavic volte. That for me, that instantly transports me. That tells me all of those different. Okay, so that's what they did. So that means that, you know, this person's under the protection of the household now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. And yeah, it makes sense. And you know, someone's just said in the chat as well, really appreciate hearing this perspective about being misrepresented by stories that are telling half truths. It's such a delicate dance when you're a writer to take these stories, these myths, these tales, and then use them as inspiration rather than a retelling.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm always sort of philosophically, I am always pro sharing cultures. And I'm always for people taking whatever they want from my culture and using it as inspiration. But I have high standards personally. So, you know, like, you know, do, you know, whatever you want with my culture, do it well.
Yeah.
And it's very, but the thing is, it takes work to do well. You know, you can't just go in and like read 2 Wikipedia entries and think yourself, you know, expert in, you know, Filipino mythology, right? Like it requires work. It requires graft. So, you know, you can do whatever you want to do, but you also have to be self-aware and know what you can research.
Absolutely. That has gone down well in the chat. Speaking of research, that seems like a really important place for us to go. You talked a little bit about your educational background, about your reading. How do you approach the research side of things when you're creating a new world and writing a new book?
So I have a head start because it's my culture.
Yes.
So I do have, you know, having grown up, you know, especially with the kind of older generation and everything I've gleaned from the older generation, because, you know, the culture is a fluid thing. It changes so much. Like the culture has changed so much in the last 20 years since I left Poland, you know? So it's obviously a lot of my materials, and this is going to be a very frustrating thing to hear for people, because a lot of my materials are in Polish. Because my family, you know, finding out that I was writing about, you know, using Slavic mythology, have generously gifted me piles and piles of books. But, you know, so there's a lot of bestiaries, right? You know, obviously, I think a good place to start if someone's interested in Slavic folklore, the best place to, bestiaries, yes. So, so basically it's like, you know, anthologies of creature descriptions, basically. And there's a lot of them in Polish. I am not entirely sure if they've been translated, very sadly and very frustratingly. But the best place for English speakers, I think, to start is simply the folk tales. So there's, you know, there's the Russian folk tales that were beautifully illustrated in the late 1900s by Ivan Bilibin. And you know, just reading the sort of the original stories is a really good place to start, because once you start going into the Slavic mythology sort of, you know, like non-fiction books, I have several of those and they all say different things.
Yeah.
So like I said, the fact that it's, you know, a lot of educated guesses are being made and it can be a little bit confusing. So obviously a lot of those stories are very interesting, and you know what some of those stories describe might be true in Lithuania but not true in Croatia, or you know, people might have worshipped Perun a bit differently in, like, well, you know, what's now Ukraine, or you know what, or Bulgaria, right? So there are those huge differences. So I think always start with actual stories themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. Just talking about the differences, I've also got the bone roots here, which is the most recent one. As you can see, I'm mid reading this one. But what I loved about this is at the back you have a glossary, which I don't know why I'm showing this, which explains, you know, the differences between the different Slavic nations and cultures and what you mean by these various terms. But I especially love that one of them is entirely made up by a character as well as yourself. So the bone roots, that's the most that came out, I think last year, was it?
Yes, end of last year,
end of last year. So let's just talk a little bit about the inventing of a character, a folkloric creature. How did you do that? What sort of things do you need to think about if you are starting to invent creatures like this?
So basically the bone roots is, just to give a thing, it's about two mothers who are trying to protect their children, and it has a bit of mystery in it because only one of them will succeed and only one of them knows why. And so one of those two mothers is Wiedźma. So she is a witch. And she acts as a kind of, you know, natural medicine sort of specialist and midwife in the local community. She's being paid for it. But she also has all this knowledge. She acts as a go-between between the local populace and in the spirit world. So the thing about the sort of Slavic world of folklore is that every creature, you know, every part of the world has its own rules. We have like different spheres of life. We have different creatures and different laws guarding guiding your life in the house, in the field, and in the wilderness, right? And the different creatures all together live there, and you have to know how to approach them. If you don't know how to approach them, you know, it's very unforgiving. You can get killed, basically. And I like the idea of having this person because I wanted to maintain this element of mystery in the book, of having this person who understands those rules, and people feel forced to rely on her to interpret those rules for her. But of course, it does leave a big power imbalance between the people and the Wiedźma. And that can create some level of distrust, of course, because, you know, whenever you have someone who is more powerful than you and you can't quite define the limits of their power, that is a bit nerve-wracking. And especially when you have some...
let me just mute someone. There we
go. And it sounded like a cat.
The cats have invaded. We had the fairies before.
Yeah, and now we have cats invading. And I mean, we have a cat in the bone roots because I literally like will squeeze in the description of my own cat in every book I can. This is my Easter egg. My Grimalkin will show up everywhere. But yeah, sorry. So I was talking about the imbalance of power. And I liked the idea of this character being able to slightly misrepresent certain things happening, but to benefit herself, and obviously, you know, to benefit her very understandable motivation to try and protect her child. So the particular character in question I have is literally the polar opposite of the existing Slavic creature. So in Slavic folklore, there's Błędnica. Błędnica is a kind of character usually, you know, taking on female form whenever she so fancies, that just purely enjoys making people get lost. And obviously in the wilderness, you know, in ancient sort of Slavic countries, which consisted mostly of deep, dark woods, that was a very dangerous proposition. So there were quite a few creatures in Slavic folklore who would just exist to get you lost in the forest or in the marshes. And, you know, because the people she was surrounded by, you know, did not know all the creatures that exist, you know, in the Slavic world. She just chose to sort of turn it on its head and say, it's like, no, this creature helps you find things. And
that's
yeah.
I started giggling because it seems to be a running theme that there are these folkloric creatures that just want to make people get lost.
Yeah.
I
I mean, the Slavic world is a fascinating place. I mean, there's creatures that, like, all they do is, if they capture you, they'll suffocate you with their bare breasts. And literally, there's 3 creatures that do the same thing.
Oh, good. I wonder what that was a warning about. You know, that's
I don't know. It feels Monty Python-esque, to be honest.
It really does. It really does. Oh my goodness. That's going to be an image I can't get rid of now. We're sort of we'll be coming up to the Q&A section shortly. So if you do have questions for Gabriella about folkloric creatures, world building, writing, whatever it might be, please pop them in the chat and be prepared. I can see some are already coming in. But I did just want to ask, obviously we've spoken a bit about your 2 adult novels, or novels for adults, I should say, given what we were just talking about. You've also written for children as well. So
Yes.
could you talk to me a little bit about how you approached that? Was it a different approach? And what were you trying to do?
It was and it wasn't. So basically, the interesting thing for me is that sometimes when I recall for people in England my, you know, the stories that I grew up on, they think that they're so terrifying and they're so dark, and they just, you know, have sort of, and I feel, you know, so perhaps my appropriated meter is broken, but I feel that children really respond to those dark stories in surprising ways sometimes. And the wind child duology, so it's the wind child and the storm child. So it's about a girl who's trying to bring her father back from the dead, basically. So in Slavic mythology, the human soul it's a Jew. We all have 2 souls, basically. We have the immortal part of us that goes on to live again, a kind of reincarnation sort of model. And then we have the mortal soul, which wants to rest after we die. And that after we die, the soul travels for 40 days until it reaches the afterlife, Navia, sorry. And then the immortal part goes on to live again, and the mortal part goes to rest among the stars. And so she has 40 days. Mara has 40 days to bring her father back from the dead. And I thought, so there's a lot of, you know, she's a very lonely child. She is a child of 2 cultures, basically, because her mother's side is Mara is the granddaughter of the god of winter winds. So she has this sort of, you know, she is attached in a way to this folkloric, this spiritual world, but she's also half human, and she looks human. She has no powers. So she feels like she doesn't fit in anywhere. And when I was writing it, I was thinking about, you know, I'm writing essentially about grief, childhood grief, and about childhood loneliness, and how difficult it is for a lonely child to learn to build up relationships. And I know that it seems like a very dark theme for a children's book, but there's so many children that go through it. And
Absolutely.
I think it is so important not to infantilize young children unnecessarily. And when it comes to those emotional upheavals, like in terms of, you know, obviously all those heavy subjects have to be treated with care. And I think it's so important to treat them with dignity. But I think it's also important not to gloss over them. And so when I was thinking about how dark children's stories in, you know, Poland are, you know, when I was growing up, compared to the stories that my British counterparts read. But I also thought that it's so important to explain, so it's not even to explain, because I don't want to be sort of, it's not like a pedagogical sort of thing, but for the children to see their own negative emotions reflected in the books they read. Because we like to, because we want to protect our children, and we want to think of them as being kind of just their existence to be sort of filled with rainbows and sunshine, but they also feel loneliness. Sometimes unfortunately parents die, the grandparents might pass, and they experience very profound grief, and even more so than adults, of this unmooring of basically being kind of lost in space. Those people that you see or identify with, and those people that sort of shape your sense of who you are and what your place in the world is when they're gone. So because children do experience it, I think it's very important for them to see those subjects covered honestly. And I think with any writing, I think treating those subjects as just as honestly as you can, not trying to maybe gloss over things to make them nicer, or just to sort of make things happier, because there's certain things you can't make happy. You can't make the loss of a parent happy. You can't certainly not without erasing the whole sort of emotional pain and growth that the character is doing, or that the readers sort of might have experienced themselves. So I think I kind of wanted to take that very Slavic darkness into the book, and kind of just sort of shed light on it a little bit from a different angle.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Abby says in the chat, exposure to deep dark feelings is very powerful, especially at that sort of age, right?
It definitely is very powerful in terms of building empathy. There's a very interesting UK charity called Empathy Lab, and they are doing a lot of work based in neuroscience, that basically, because new research shows that reading has the power to increase our empathy, our ability to feel empathy in a very real sense. If you have two people connected to a brain scan, and one person sniffs cinnamon and the other person reads the word cinnamon, the same parts of the brain light up.
Wow. Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. I think reading stories that are not our own, but that still treat things with honesty, I think it really has a capacity to help people sort of find their own place in the world and grow.
Absolutely. I can see questions starting to come in, so I'll ask one more, and then we'll go to the people that have come here to see you. But I'm just wondering, one of the things that I personally get really worried about in my own writing is when I am taking inspiration from something that is real or is important, like as in a folk tale. I get really worried about doing it right, or the reaction of other people to what I've done. And obviously you are not telling these specific stories, but you're taking inspiration from them. I'm just wondering what sort of reaction you've had from, I guess, Slavic folklore experts or people who grew up with these stories. Have you had obviously people love or hate books, it's all good, but I'm just wondering if that was a worry for you, and how sort of that has played out.
Well, I'll be honest, it was not a worry for me at all, because in general, I try not to be worried about what people might think of me. Which is, I understand this is we live in a very complicated world. I have not had any negative reactions to that aspect of my writing at all, I think. But I had a very interesting thing I read. Somebody got the early copy of my book, and they wrote on, I don't remember if it was NetGalley's or Goodreads, whatever, doesn't matter. They wrote I requested this book, seeing the Scottish surname of the author, not because I wanted to read the book, but because I wanted to tear it apart for cultural appropriation. But then I read that the author is actually Polish, so it might be all right.
Oh my goodness. People just
And
want to create trouble, don't they?
I mean, I just laughed. Of course, like the name of the person writing it was very English as well, which kind of shows you that people from the cultures are often, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but if you're from a particular culture, like, I am very happy if people go out of a way to research Slavic folklore or Slavic culture, and they get inspired by it. I find it really furthers the kind of cultural dialogue, and I am always very happy about it. I have, but that being said, I have also read books which claimed to be inspired by Slavic folklore, and literally the only Slavic element was that someone was called Ivan. and you just feel like that is lazy, and I am I might be quite like harsh. I feel like do the work, you want to do something. Anytime you feel inspired by a different culture, you just have to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not rocket science. I read those stories. Those same stories are available to you. Maybe not the ones in Polish, but but those, all of the research I've done, you can do. And it's but of course sometimes you will have stories that have only tangentially touch upon the folklore, and that doesn't require that much effort, like obviously if you have a short story that's inspired by a creature you read a story about once, but there's nothing, I don't see anything wrong with that.
It's interesting. It's what came to my mind just then was the prevalence now of books about witches that lean on Baba Yaga and that sort of imagery of the chicken-footed huts and that sort of thing. Yeah,
it's a very powerful image for sure, and it's so I've seen some of that, and I mean, it's interesting, it's interesting for me what angles people choose to take, because there are many angles to take with each of those creatures. My way is not the only way. I am always interested in the rules. I'm interested, and same way that if I do world building, I'm interested in the rules that everybody in this society follows, even if they don't mention them outright. And with Baba Yaga, for example, she follows her own rules. Her rule, she might be cheating, but she cheats according to the predetermined, markers that she herself set up. So it's so that in itself is interesting. In Slavic folklore, we don't have many tricksters per se, for example. So we don't really or tricks are quite simple, as in you can see that someone's about to swindle you and then you swindle them first.
I loads of questions coming in, so I'm just going to turn to them now. I did have a couple of questions in advance from Sophie, who I can see has popped some in the chat as well, so I just wanted to ask these first. Sophie's wondering, in fantasy, when you're creating fantasy, do you write your characters for the world or the world for the characters?
So my books are very character led. So I usually start with a concept, in the second bell, for example, I had this concept of kind of mothers who will choose to leave the community and everything they know in order to protect their children, and they still don't know if those children are monsters or not. So they're taking a leap of faith and then you have those two communities that kind of try to coexist with this otherworldly power. So that was my starting point. And from then on, I started thinking, for example, just to continue with the second bell as an example, when I approached the world building element, I had this sense of, okay, so if I have a community in mountains where, you know, that those mothers are leaving, that community is a mining community, you know, they're a little bit, you know, secluded, but they're still connected to the world. And so they have all the modern day 18th century conveniences, you know, available. But those mothers that leave the community and go even higher up in the mountains are completely cut off from the world. What sort of environment would they have? And, you know, so basically I went like, okay, so, you know, they would have some goats, you know, so obviously, you know, those goats are very important to their local economics. Like, you know, how would they build their houses? How would they, you know, if you have that kind of community, how do you operate it in order to make sure that, you know, nobody starves in your community? So world building sort of was led by the character's developments, you know, like, so if a character goes off somewhere, what do they have to do to adapt? And if people before them move to that place and set up a community, how would that community be set up? Because a lot of, you know, the sort of societal rules and the way we do things is linked very much to the economics and, you know, who are we surrounded by, you know, what the seasons are like, things like that. Yeah. In the Bone Roots, it's a larger community. It's obviously, you know, we have a small town, and because there's more prosperity there, you have a much more developed class system. So those elements came into play as well, about how people from the different classes would interact with each other, how they're you know, how would the sort of poorest of a community sort of exist and coexist with the sort of upper classes, and so all of that. But for me, I start with the characters. I do know some people who start with world building, but it purely depends on what you want your book to be about.
Yeah. And just on that idea of the rules and the law and that sort of that side of things, you know, how do you keep it so that these rules don't overpower the plot and the action?
Well, I think basically you don't necessarily spell those rules out. Like, you know, like with any world building, the author knows a lot more than they let on, you know, that is described in the plot, but the actions of the characters are very much informed by those rules. So this concept of you can't have something for nothing, you know, that is a very strong rule sort of that exists in Slavic folklore. Like, you know, you have creatures that are purely benevolent, you know, the domovoi, he will come and like he will look after your house for you and like make sure you're safe, but you have to give him something, you know, a little something, you know, a bit of bread, a crust of bread, a bit of, you know, a bit of milk. And, you know, in my book, like I kind of expanded on that concept as well, that there's that what you do in order to get a domovoi. But all of those things I think have to be kind of present, and you have to know about them. And as long as you write it and you know those rules, I think they'll shine through on a page. Yeah.
Oh, I'm keeping one eye on the time. We've got so many questions. I want to make sure I get through something for everybody. Something super simple. Abby is asking, says you may have mentioned it, but do you have a recommended book? Maybe it's yours for some of these traditional Slavic stories and folklore.
I think from all the books I've written, The Bone Roots, my most recent one, has the most of that. So it will have the most of the kind of everyday aspect of how people coexist with the Slavic creatures. When it comes to the kind of original texts, from the ones that exist in the English language, I think the most commonly recommended one is just the fairy tales, Russian fairy tales or folk tales. I remember the ones that are illustrated by Ivan Bilibin. So those are often the ones that people think about when they think about Slavic stories, but they are fairy tales.
Helen is asking if something is inspired by, does that give you more freedom? Because Helen's writing a story inspired by a Micronesian folk tale that was told to them when they were out there.
Absolutely. I mean, it gives you a lot more freedom than if you're writing a PhD on the subject. But you know, how much you want to draw inspiration from a place is, you know, entirely up to you. I think the one thing that I would think about is what exactly you're drawing inspiration from. Are you just drawing inspiration from a name, or are you drawing inspiration from how that particular, for example, creature or how that myth sort of operates? So that is, I mean, for me, that is the difference between, you know, just mentioning a culture and actually appreciating it and taking the time to look at it. So of course it's easier when you're inspired by, like, you know, you can you know, take one aspect and see how it works in the modern day, right? But again, like, reading the source materials is quite important, just to make sure that you have full appreciation of the story, and I think it will give you a lot more ideas as well.
That actually leads really nicely into the next question. Jumping back to writing authentic stories from different cultures, have you been asked to read other people's work to provide feedback on authenticity, and how did you feel about being asked?
I haven't been asked. I think it really depends what the purpose of it is, because so I think it's a very difficult subject. Like, there is a place for it. Like, you know, I have interviewed Genevieve Gornichek, who wrote the Witch's Heart, and then most recently The Weaver and the Witch Queen, and because she was touching on the spiritual aspects of the Sami culture, so the indigenous Norwegian people, she had someone help her make sure, because there's not many written materials on that, so it's not something you can easily read. But I think in terms of, you know, you have to have a very clear idea in mind about what you want to do. And I always lean towards, like, you know, if you want to pay people on the research stage, you know, like, and again, going back to self-awareness about how much are you actually able to research. And yeah, so that is the
Thank you. Sophie also had some quite specific questions about writing. I'm just wondering, rather than because obviously the answer is probably going to be, it's up to you, you're the writer. Do you personally have any recommendations for places people can go to learn more about the craft of fantasy writing or folktale writing?
The craft of fantasy writing, it's just writing. I mean, I think, you know, what draws me personally to sort of speculative fiction, you know, as a genre, is that it gives me, you know, I kind of think about a concept that I would like to explore, or maybe a question that I would like to answer for myself. And it gives me absolute freedom, the genre, to create a world that really shines light on that particular issue I'm interested in. So I think if you're naturally drawn to the fantasy genre, then it just you just work on your writing in general, because good writing is good writing. So whether or not you're going to write in fantasy or crime or romance, it's basically what you're naturally drawn to.
And I guess also, like, if you're thinking about creating your own creatures, your own lore, your own systems, it's down to your own imagination. There is no right or wrong way to do it.
It has to be, I think, like, the only thing is, like, it has to be internally consistent. So you have, like, there is a lot of kind of work involved, like mental work, in making sure that you don't have elements that don't coexist well within the rules you've already created.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one more from the chat. I'm going to ask if Abby wants to ask this herself, because it's very specific.
Thank you so much for that talk, Gabriella. It has really sparked a lot of ideas, so I appreciate you taking time.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, it is a very specific question about, you mentioned something about beasts that smother you with their breasts, and I have a friend that's doing a weird breastfeeding story. So I just wondered, can you?
I just happen to have a friend that does it all the time.
No. I was like asking for a friend, but I am actually asking for a friend. So I don't. Was that a specific story somewhere, or was that? Yeah, do you know?
No,
if you don't know,
like, those were from this Polish bestiary. I was just reading this Polish bestiary, and it was, I got to a third creature that does the same thing, and I was like, okay.
Okay, maybe
feels a little obsessive. It feels a little obsessive. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I understand.
One of the creatures was called it's to Polish. It's called cycocha, which basically means big tits.
Okay.
But sorry, I hope it's okay. But and then there's it's just translation. It's just, purely for scientific reasons. And then there's Mamuna as well. Mamuna, who's they do all kinds of other things, Mamune, but they do that as well.
Thank you for answering that slightly off color question. I appreciate
it. Thank you, Abby, for asking a slightly off color question. I think, just don't go off and Google Polish big-breasted demon, because it might give you something you don't want to see.
Yeah.
On that note, now that I've totally derailed the conversation, Gabriella, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for being so gracious with answering questions. Everybody, please do go out, read Gabriella's stories. They are all out there, and watch the YouTube show, listen to the podcast, support, etc. Gabriella, thank you. Everybody, if you want to unmute, and we shall give her a round of applause. Yeah. You have to do the yay at the same time, don't you? It's like, it's law.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I had a great time.
Thank you. And you're welcome to stick around if you need to, but I also know it's a Saturday afternoon for you. There is lots going on, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm abroad with my family, so I have to skedaddle, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you so much for joining us while you're abroad. But yeah, everybody else, we're now going to go into a break. We'll be back at 12:30 with our next world tour. I can see Ava's already with us. Hello. We'll be back very, very shortly. So thank you, and thanks again, Gabriella.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, I'm going to hit stop on the recording.